it's worth going back to the beginning of that. I know we only have a limited amount of time. I'm not even sure how
Let's
long I was
just
talking.
no, let's just move forward
Okay.
uh, and okay, I'm recording now, so that I'll just maybe just give like a 30-second summary.
Sure. Okay. So what I'm showing here is how I currently manage infrastructure using Kustomize, a fork of Kustomize. So what I'm describing isn't yet possible, but I believe that were it made possible, this sort of solves configuration management for Kubernetes. Like I have been using it for a year, and everything I throw at it works. The idea is that in any individual environment, you have a set of values that differentiate it from another environment. And so in this context here, we're generating a bunch of flat files that have one value in them, indicating that like the dev environment might be in a different region than the prod environment, might have a different host name, et cetera, and so forth. The first step, the first place that Kustomize comes into usage is by consuming all of those and turning it into a config map that is then vended to every other part of the stack. One thing that doesn't happen today in Kustomize that I believe should, I think this is a really important axiom that if we all agreed upon, would answer almost every question we have about like, should we implement this feature or not, or like what's wrong with scoping, is that we can do whatever we want inside a customization YAML, including templating. But what comes out the other end has to just be a new YAML stream. And whatever consumes that has no idea what happened in here. So it should be completely transparent. That is not the case today. And so here I've shown that our first step in the dev environment is to produce the global variables that get passed on to our base deployment. Our base deployment then becomes aware of the environment that it's running in. Then we have applications here that are themselves consuming that base deployment. And what I didn't state earlier is that our applications, just like our infrastructure over here, have individual pieces of data that are specific to them, that have nothing to do with Kustomize, that we need access to before the cluster even exists. Our individual applications themselves have metadata that describe the name of the application, maybe the container, the host that the container gets pushed to. All of this stuff has nothing to do with Kustomize. All kinds of tooling needs access to it, so it shouldn't be buried in Kustomize. It's just a plain YAML file. What I'd like to do, in the same way here I generate a config map, is be able to pull in from the manifest the name of the app. And then I can put in here the name of the app automatically by just saying consume it from here. And in that way, this customization YAML, this one, and this one, and this one are all exactly the same. They're just deferring out to this YAML file. It's the exact same pattern that happens at the infrastructure level, but instead of being flat files, which are just easy for shell scripting, I guess you could use Spruce or JQ or whatever for these if they were YAML. Like it's the same concept of saying the source of truth is an external file that a customization YAML references. So at any rate, all of these things pass down. If we follow through with the idea that these things are black boxes and everything that comes out of them is just straight up new YAML, we know nothing about what happened behind it, it allows us to have, at the end, one final customization YAML whose job is just to aggregate all of the applications, and you have a one shot to deploy the entire thing. Or if as an operator you need to deploy an individual one, you can equally just go back to this one and deploy that one independently, or deploy that one independently. And so this is just an aggregation, and that works today. I'm sorry, today in Kustomize, because of all of the scoping issues around the fact that like we're trying to pass context between customizations, it gets very confusing up here. Like who owns what precedence for what? How does this work? It doesn't work at all. And the way that it should work, I believe, again, I'll just keep repeating myself, is that what goes into a customization YAML, what happens in it, that's the purview of the customization. What comes out is just raw YAML, period. And the next thing, that's all it knows about. Any
That's great.
thoughts, questions, concerns?
We got 7 minutes, so that's perfect.
Cool. So yeah, I guess the feature that I'm requesting is the removal of vars and the ability to do like Go templating inside customization YAMLs. I don't really know what the impacts of that end up ultimately being, but if that general concept is something that the maintainers feel like they would be potentially amenable to landing, I'd be interested in exploring actually implementing that, because I do believe that we need templating to do our jobs, but those templates can't exist in our YAML files. What we should be templating, what we should be creating with our templates is patches, because patches do everything. There's literally nothing I can't do to an incoming YAML with a patch. I just don't want to write the patch because it's really verbose and painful to look at. But if I can generate the patches inside the customization YAML, I'm done. And today I do that on a very, very large project scale but it's just very verbose and ugly and hard to reason about because I have no way of templating inside the customization YAML.
Hey, Tyler, would you take a look at the notes I took for what you said in the agenda and just make sure they accurately reflect?
Yeah, is it all right if I do that after?
Yeah, go ahead and do that after, please.
Okay, cool.
Um,
Um,
if no one else has anything, does anyone else besides me have thoughts or comments on this?
So the main difference, Tyler, this is Sean Sullivan. So the main difference that you're proposing is adding templating to the customization.yaml.
I would say as an initial step, not adding templating, but just making these things black boxes. So there's the only thing they output is raw YAML would be the first step. And I think if we did that, like how we deal with that, the fallout from that is going to lead to something that's architecturally sound. I think templating inside customization YAML would be helpful, but I also think that it would be fine for us to say like that's not customization's job, and maybe the customization YAMLs themselves are like executable somehow. And then they could just be any programming language and you're done. But the ultimate result is just some way to programmatically generate patches. That's all we need. And we're done. The base primitives are there. They work. There's nothing I haven't been able to configure. It's just ugly.
What you're saying about the black box, it's interesting hearing you saying this because I have I've started to desire the same sort of behavior. Coming from a different motivation, but I think it's a sound architecture, right? Which is, again, like focusing on interoperability and composability. If what comes out of a customization YAML is just a black box, and you can customize that black box, then it means you can be composing Kustomize. You can customize inputs from other customizations and other tools that aren't customized, but maybe like you generate configuration from code or something like that. And if the API between the customization black boxes is well defined, you could even like do crazy stuff like generate configuration from code, but mark it up with the customization breadcrumbs so that it can be further customized or these sorts of things, right? And so you're not restricted to what's available in the customized tool to be able to leverage.
Yeah. And if you did need to pass context between these two things, you could pass it as a config map that this thing consumes, or you could pass it as annotations that this thing consumes, but ultimately it's just YAML. And Sean, to your specific point, like the absolute minimum viable, turn this into a black box, it could work thing would be the replacements POC that Jingfang and, oh my God, I'm completely drawing a blank. Jeff, thank you, yes. That Jingfang and Jeff put in place. If we could use that in conjunction with the ability to access external files as a source of the value, we're done too. Like replacements are ultimately all I'm doing. I'm swapping it from the config map to somewhere else. And that would work.
So if I could also, again, kind of paraphrase, the big pain point is the context in between these steps, the state that's being passed along through these steps ends up being problematic. Is that does that sound accurate?
That is accurate. Yes, if you want like a very, very specific pain point of like VARs as they exist today, after this, I can post a link to a really, really small example of how doing this pattern in the existing structure causes a conflict that can't be resolved.
I can give more context on this.
Cool.
So currently we need to know all the directory structure, like way back to your base customization, because we have some special transformation that need to be applied as the final step. So there are two of those special transformations. One is the vars, as Taylor just mentioned, so which we may have something else to replace it. The other is the name reference transformation. So which means, for example, if you use in the service, it refers to some deployment. So we need to like take that last, replace if you add some name prefix or suffix to the deployment, we want to replace the reference in the service as the final step. So that's why we have the, let's say we call it global transformation as the last step. So this blocks us like making it as customized, that's not being aware of what has been handled previously. So if we can have another way to handle those name reference and var things, I think making the change to support this black box architecture is not hard.
Yeah, I mean, it is something we'd actually discussed, and I even have a proof of concept. It's not a prototype, but it's a proof of concept that proves it a different way, which is that it is reentrant and writes customizations back to the source, right? So rather than producing an output, it writes them back, and so it can actually reverse every customization it's made and then apply a new set of customizations. And if you can reverse every customization you've made, then I think there's a high degree of confidence that you have the data you need to reconstruct what had been done in the past and that sort of stuff. But it's not mature enough to know what the APIs are. Oh, and that's the alarm.
So yeah, if we agreed the black box thing is right, what ultimately falls out of that, I don't know, but it just feels right. Every time I was confused about what was happening with Kustomize, it was because I was expecting this and it wasn't doing that.
Yeah, totally. It sounds like we should follow up on this because we agree with the architectural principles behind it. Cool. All right, and that's time on that issue. So maybe we can follow up offline, and then if we decide that it's a priority for staffing this and we can build a design around it, let's maybe have a deep dive into what that would look like.
Cool.
Okay, variables. So the bullet points here are they're being used more than they were intended for. I think we kind of covered that, but for the recording, which I think didn't capture this because I started it late, is that variables, the intended purpose of variables was to address that Kustomize changes name references with name prefix and name suffix. And sometimes there are references to these names inside areas that we cannot determine from the schema that it's a reference. In particular, an environment variable or an argument, command line argument, may in fact be a reference to a service, but when that service's name is changed by a customized name prefix or name suffix, that is not reflected in the argument or environment variable, which is supposed to match that value. So the intended variables were actually introduced mainly to address that particular edge case around transformations of references. The use of substitutions has been something that we have historically shied away from, I think, for a number of different reasons. At least one of those reasons was because there are a lot of solutions in the ecosystem that do substitutions, and we didn't want to just jump in and like start building a solution that for something that is already being solved by the ecosystem or might be solved by the ecosystem. So we want to make sure like whatever solutions we do pursue, we're not just replicating something that's been solved by someone else. Another is that the way substitutions we considered in the past didn't adhere to, the implementations did not adhere to a lot of the principles around the ability to validate schema and make sure that things remain in the API format rather than introducing like for loops and this sort of stuff. And this probably goes back to that black box discussion, but reasons for not doing that is it makes like you can't patch something with a for loop in it very effectively and these sorts of things. Should these workflows be in a specialized API? Okay, I wrote that. This is something, this is probably a broader scope, but maybe touches on this, which is I can see the Kustomize API evolving in a lot of different ways for more specialized things. And if we think about the pod API in Kubernetes, like pod doesn't have replicas built into it, and it doesn't have rollout strategy, and it doesn't have a lot of these things. It's a low-level primitive. And we did tell people it's typically not something you use on its own. There are reasons people do it, and if you're building higher level abstractions, it's one of them, or if you're doing a runoff job as part of a tutorial, these sorts of things. It can make sense to run a pod, but typically users are doing most of their work in deployments and stateful sets and daemon sets and jobs and these sorts of things, right? And we developed a lot of kinds, and those APIs look a lot like each other. You look at the stateful set and deployment API, and they look very similar to one another, but they have some notable differences. And so one thing I think to consider as we evolve these APIs, if we decide that we want to introduce something that seems like it is now building more on top of the low-level primitives in Kustomize, and I don't know what that looks like, but something to keep an eye out for is, should we build another API that is a high level, that can be tailored for a specific workflow, right? And how could we maybe start introducing those APIs is something, and I introduced that mainly here because it seems like what Tyler is suggesting is very powerful from a workflow perspective. Whereas something like adding labels and annotations is not powerful from a workflow perspective, but more of a low-level surgical task. Features that recognize. Tyler, do you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, sure. This again takes the assumption that a customization is a black box. So we do have variables, but only in the confines of one file. If we can get values from external files into a customization, then we have the ability to make customization files effectively just boilerplate that we cut and paste between projects, because they'll just reference files at a well-known location, and you can do everything that you need to do by just using the same boilerplate everywhere. And it also allows you then to do, maybe the one-off weird thing that has to happen for your, a given project. And so that's just not the only way to do that today is to use a config map generator, which honestly isn't that bad. You bring in your external values as a config map. You do your replacements back and forth between those values, but there's no affordance for what happens if I have two separate discrete values that I need to combine in some way.
And I want to clarify to make sure I understand what you're suggesting is effectively performing variable substitution into the customization YAML itself. Is that right?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, to produce a patch. My base assumption here is that every single modification you want to do is authored as a patch, whether it be a replacement or an actual JSON patch reference. But in creating those patches, we need variables. I need to know what the name of the application is in order to find the path to the secret, because the secret path has the app name in it. I need to be able to interpolate that into a patch or into a replacement. So just wholesale grabbing one property from a different resource and putting it into a new resource isn't enough. I need to be able to combine multiple values somehow. I don't know what, we've explored some possible ways of doing that in YAML, and what it ends up looking like is asking a developer or an operator to write an abstract syntax tree where you're I want to combine two values, but I don't have variables, so I'm going to write it out as an AST. It's very confusing to look at. It does solve the problem, but I just would rather say yeah, you can do templating inside the customization YAML. You can import a value and just use it as many places as you want, but it's not visible anywhere else.
The customization YAML itself can be templated.
Or that, yeah.
And then the resources themselves are modified through the mechanisms which Kustomize.
Yeah. And I think I think the actual solution to this, if you live in a world where you're not pulling in customization YAMLs from external sources, is just let the customization YAMLs be executable, and people can write whatever they want in whatever programming language they want, and you're done.
I didn't quite catch that last part. Let the customization YAML be an executable?
Yeah. If it's got a hashbang on it, or if it's got an execute bit, execute it, and you're done.
Execute it to generate and customize against the output of that.
Yeah, but again, it assumes it's all self-contained and safe. But that solution, you're just done. Anybody can use any programming language they want to do whatever they want. You can go grab files however you want, and it's just not in Kustomize's purview to ever have to think about it.
We do have to be careful we'd have to think very carefully about the security implications of that.
Yeah.
Especially when you change behavior.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if it were behind a flag that just says we consider everything safe, we're fine to execute this.
Right. Or if we create a new kind, right?
Yeah.
Or something like this, right? But yeah, there's ways to address it. We just you need to think about it.
Mhm.
And I also want to clarify, there's templating, which means you can do like, network calls to random services and, do effectively whatever you want under the sky, right? And then there's like, I want to substitute these values in for these existing values. Like, is it like 90% substitution, 10% network calls and for loops, or is it like the inversion of that?
It's all I want to do is generate patches or replacements, but the ways that I produce those patches and replacements need infinite variability.
I see. One
Like
thing.
I can give one concrete example.
Mhm.
If I have a Prometheus configuration, and I want, like, that itself is YAML, and I need to, in one context, append some additional configuration to it. Like, I want my source Prometheus to be generic, and I want the Prometheus configuration that ultimately ends up being spit out into a config map and consumed by Prometheus itself to like add one thing that says like, you're gonna send all of your information to a remote write API at this URL or something like that. And like, this is just, it's still a patch. I'm patching that YAML, but it's like, doesn't have anything to do with Kubernetes. I need the ability to generate patches and replacements with infinite variability. But I don't want to put any of that in the customization manifests. I don't want variables anywhere in a manifest. I just want to be able to, yeah, I'm saying the same thing over and over, so I'll shut up.
Okay, we got 7 minutes left. I'd love to hear from the folks who haven't talked as much about responses, opinions, feelings on all the discussion. We could sit here awkwardly for 7 minutes too. I'm fine with that.
Hi, my name is Katrina. Actually, I'll start my video so you can see me. I work at Shopify, and we originally let our developers use full templating system to modify their Kubernetes manifests. So I'm very familiar with how painful it can be to open that box. So first of all, the earlier discussion about having a line like considering customization of black box and just spits out YAML, and then the next one just consumes YAML for composability, that makes a lot of sense to me. But the idea of letting arbitrary templates be used inside the customization itself, that does sound really scary to me, to be honest. We did have people doing things internally, like reaching out to arbitrary APIs and pulling in data and doing just really crazy things because they could and it was easy. So when you open the doors wider, that people who want to operate platforms like me, we won't want to use it as a solution anymore because it's too permissive. And I don't know, it's really important to be super careful about what you expose to the user and to make it as restrictive as you can within the needs. I'm not familiar enough though with your specific use case to have an opinion on what you could be doing now.
I think you're absolutely right. In the context of our deployed applications that developers are interacting with, a reduced set of functionality absolutely is enough. And I don't want developers doing crazy stuff configuring their apps, because I've seen that too. But when it comes to the underlying infrastructure that's being deployed, that the apps are themselves deploying into, as an operator and a very experienced SRE, like, there is a lot of weird configuration you have to do to stand up Kubernetes and Grafana and Prometheus and all those things. And I need that power there and somehow. But honestly, like, if we just started with this thing as a black box and then very slowly, incrementally figured out what things broke as a result and what things we add back, like, I'm fully supportive of the idea that just letting people do anything results in chaos. I've seen it everywhere too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great on the things where we're like, oh, we all agree that this is a low risk improvement that we'd all love to see, move forward on those. On things where it's like, this could offer a lot of benefits, but could offer a lot of pain. We defer while we do the things we all agree upon and try and figure out what the right ways of doing it. And then in the areas where it's like, yeah, this makes sense in some contexts, and not in others, we develop different APIs, right? And then within an organization, you're like, use this API, don't use the other API, because our tooling is set up to expect this sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm. One thing that's come up a lot on the issue tracker that speaks to this particular point is also the one that I was speaking about Prometheus, where like you've got folks who are like, hey, I've got some YAML, but it's like totally unstructured YAML that configures some binary somewhere that has nothing to do with Kubernetes. People are trying to use Kustomize to like modify that somehow. And I'm trying to do that also by saying, just make the customized file executable and it should output the customization YAML. But ultimately, I think it would be okay to just say, like hardline clear in the documentation, that's outside the scope of responsibility of Kustomize. You have to pre-configure that somewhere else, and then you can consume your config file. We don't do that. That would be better than the current situation today where like vars are partially there and you try to use them and it doesn't work and then you get lost for a week.
Hey, Katrina, I'm going to pick on you just because you spoke up. Between and your name's on a couple of these things, between the open API schema stuff, the black box customization stuff, and then anything else that maybe your name is on that I didn't catch, maybe variables. Do you see like a big win in one of those over the, like, where would you prioritize putting your beans if you had them?
I was more interested in the variable and black box things like from the philosophical angle. On the practical side, I think the open API schema is like very, very interesting to me. I am designing a more restrictive configuration system that's kind of inspired by Kustomize internally here, and it does need variable interpolation right now, and a lot of that is because there are properties that are semantically important to us that we can't encode into the schema. So we have to like schematize that as part of our own API. So I'm very interested in seeing what the possibilities might be there, what it could look like, and how I might be able to use that.
Awesome. We'll have to make sure that we build things as modular libraries so that when folks like yourself are building your own platforms and not maybe accessing the functionality through the customization YAML, that you're able to get the pieces and reconstruct them.
Speaking as someone who's doing...
In particular, the container image one strikes me as super useful because that's something that I've effectively had to, like I've basically encoded that in my output resources because I have multiple tools that want to consume that information. And like that container, like we have a thing called like an app image, basically it's the main container image for that application. And we've tagged that as metadata so that all our various tools can consume that as semantic information. It would be cool if that was actually in the schema because that's always the case there.
Yeah, let's follow up. I'd love to hear more about that and see how we can, make it maybe a more general pattern if it seems like it'd be useful to everyone.
I could say as someone who's doing the same thing, building an internal tool that a lot of the things Kustomize does that I care about are buried in Kustomize, and you putting it in open schema saying this is where the namespace replacements go, this is where these, like that would make that, a lot easier to take the knowledge that's been tested in this library and use it elsewhere.
Cool. Tyler, would you like me to, I've been tagging Katrina on the PRs, the open API PRs. Would you like me to tag you as well?
Yeah, I'd love that.
Cool. All right, we're out of time. Are there any final thoughts? And was this a good idea? Would folks like to see another one like in a month or something like that as a follow-up? Anything else?
My only question would be, how is this different than the standard SIG-CLI meeting? Is it just that the SIG-CLI meeting has a larger scope?
Yeah, I'd say the SIG-CLI meeting, Sean, were you going to pipe in there? Did you want to say something?
I'm sure that you're going to, yeah, I found this. I found this to be really useful in that, you're right, the scope is significantly smaller. But also that it's thinking bigger, right? A lot of what we do in our SIG-CLI meetings is logistics and maintenance, and having a separate space to be able to think big feels like a really important ability. I really appreciate this. Thanks for organizing this.
Yeah, I agree with everything Sean said, and just to, maybe I'll add on because I like to hear myself talk. during the SIG-CLI meeting is a chance for different teams who are working on sub-projects to kind of coordinate and give status updates and ask questions about one another and form announcements. And so during the SIG-CLI meeting, we try and make sure like someone could look at the notes even if they didn't attend and say, I have an idea of what's going on, and not kind of be surprised about what's coming down the pipeline. You could argue that to the degree at which we're successful on that point, but that is the intention, which means it tends to be pretty structured and doesn't allow us to like deep dive into design issues. We tend to try to cut those discussions off, although not always successfully. Whereas this meeting, the intention was no tactical stuff, just let's talk about the architecture we would like to see moving forward.
Well, I would come to any and all of these that were scheduled. I hope that at some point we would, I think this would become almost irrelevant once the high-level concepts we're talking about become actualized, but maybe there's another layer to this that we haven't seen yet. Probably always is.
Yeah, once we solve all the problems and agree upon all the solutions, we don't need to meet anymore, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
I'll keep my calendar open. Okay, why don't I schedule another one of these a month from now? I think this strategic stuff, it kind of helps for us to mull over for longer periods of time, like having a bi-weekly maybe might be a little too often, but I'll try and schedule one for a month from now. And then if you did join, if you're comfortable adding your names to the agenda, just so that I can make sure that we're able to reach out and make sure everyone gets included in the right spots, that would be great. All right, thank you everyone for attending. See you around.
Thanks for scheduling this. Nice to meet you all.